The greatest discoveries in human history are not found in museums or textbooks. They are hidden in abandoned wells, concealed by wars, and buried beneath decades of silence. And sometimes, when they finally surface, the experts take one look and say, "That's not human." Tonight, we're going to sit with one of those discoveries. This is the story of a skull so huge, so strange, that the first people who saw it could not believe it ever belonged to anything like us. A giant cranium with a heavy brow, cavernous eye sockets, and teeth built for something far more powerful than modern humans. For nearly 90 years it was kept in the dark, ignored by science, protected by fear, and written out of the story of our own origins. They call him Dragon Man. A giant among our ancestors whose very existence doesn't just add a new footnote to human evolution, it tears straight through the middle of the story we thought was finished. To many researchers, Dragon Man is not human in the way we usually mean that word, not our species, not Homo sapiens, a different kind of person who walked the earth beside us and then disappeared. While textbooks showed simple diagrams of a neat, tidy family tree, this skull lay hidden at the bottom of a well in China. While scientists argued over theories and timelines, the most important piece of the puzzle was gathering dust in secret, watched over by a single ordinary worker who believed it was too important to fall into the wrong hands. Tonight, we're going to bring that skull into the light. We'll follow it from the moment a shovel struck something impossible in the mud of a riverbank, through the years when it was hidden from invading armies, through the decades when science pretended it didn't exist, to the moment modern technology finally revealed what it truly was. Settle in, get comfortable, because once you hear the full story of Dragon Man, the giant skull science couldn't explain for 80 years, you may never look at the word human the same way again. This is not just a story of scientific discovery, this is a tale of wartime secrets, political upheaval, and a worker who made a choice that would echo through history. It is the story of how the greatest paleontological find of the century was almost lost forever, and how its emergence would force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own species. The year was 1933. The world was on the brink of chaos. In Manchuria, Japanese forces had carved out their puppet state, controlling railroads, industries, and the lives of millions. It was here in the city of Harbin that a Chinese labourer working on the Dongjiang Bridge made a discovery that would change everything. As his shovel struck the river bank of the Songhua River, it uncovered something that should not have been there. A skull. But not just any skull. This was the cranium of something that was undeniably human, yet impossibly large. The worker stared at the massive bone structure, its heavy brow ridge casting shadows over empty eye sockets that once housed eyes. The skull was enormous, larger than any human remains he had ever seen. The labourer understood immediately that this was no ordinary find. Just 4 years earlier, the discovery of Peking Man had electrified the scientific world and captured the imagination of the Chinese people. Ancient human remains had become symbols of national pride and scientific achievement. But this skull was different. This skull was a giant. Standing there on the riverbank, holding this colossal cranium in his hands, the worker faced an impossible choice. The Japanese authorities controlled everything in Manchuria. They would seize this discovery, claim it for their puppet state, and rob China of yet another piece of its heritage. But what could one man do against an occupying army? The answer came from the depths of Chinese tradition. For centuries, when foreign invaders threatened, the people had hidden their most precious treasures in wells and underground chambers, waiting for the storm to pass. The worker would do the same. He would conceal this ancient giant until China was free again. Under cover of darkness, he carried the skull to an abandoned well. The cranium that had once housed a brain similar in size to our own, that had belonged to a powerful individual who lived in the forests of ancient China, disappeared into the earth once more. The well became a time capsule, preserving not just bone and mineral but hope itself. Years passed. The Japanese occupation continued its brutal grip on Manchuria. The worker kept his secret, speaking of it to no one. Even after the Soviet invasion of 1945 finally drove out the Japanese forces, he remained silent. The political landscape of China was shifting again, and anyone who had worked for the Japanese-controlled railway faced suspicion and persecution. The skull remained in its hiding place as the Chinese Civil War raged above. It stayed hidden as the Communist Party took control and began reshaping the nation. Decades rolled by. The worker grew old, carrying his secret like a weight upon his shoulders. The giant in the well remained forgotten, a ghost from the distant past waiting in the darkness. But the skull itself tells a story that transcends political boundaries and human conflicts. When scientists would finally examine this remarkable specimen, they would discover that it belonged to an individual who lived approximately 146,000 years ago, during the Middle Pleistocene period. This was a time when the world was a very different place, when multiple species of humans walked the earth simultaneously. The Dragon Man, as researchers would eventually call him, was likely a male in his 50s. He was enormous by the standards of his time, a powerful figure who lived in a small hunter-gatherer community on the forested floodplains of northeastern China. The environment he inhabited could be harsh and unforgiving, with bitter cold winters that would have tested the survival skills of even the most adapted humans. His skull tells the story of his life written in bone. The massive cranium housed a brain that was similar in size to our own, suggesting intelligence and cognitive abilities that were remarkably advanced. Yet other features of his anatomy were distinctly archaic. The thick brow ridge that jutted out above his eyes was a characteristic inherited from much earlier human ancestors. His eye sockets were large and almost square in shape, giving his face a unique and powerful appearance. The mouth was wide, designed to accommodate teeth that were much larger than those of modern humans. These oversized teeth suggest a diet that required significant chewing power, perhaps including tough plant materials and raw meat that demanded strong jaw muscles and robust dental structures. Every aspect of his anatomy spoke of a being that was built for survival in a challenging world. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Dragon Man was not his size or his strength. It was his place in the human family tree. When advanced dating techniques were finally applied to his remains, scientists discovered that he lived at a crucial moment in human evolution. This was the period when different human species were diverging, when the ancestors of modern humans, Neanderthals and other archaic peoples were following separate evolutionary paths. The timing of his existence, combined with the unique features of his anatomy, would eventually place Dragon Man at the center of one of the most important debates in human evolution. Was he simply a regional variant of a known species? Or did he represent something entirely new, a branch of the human family tree that had been completely unknown to science? The skull remained in its well as the world above continued to change. The Cultural Revolution swept through China, bringing upheaval and transformation to every aspect of society. Archaeological sites were abandoned or destroyed. Scientists faced persecution. The pursuit of knowledge about human evolution became a dangerous endeavor, associated with foreign influence and bourgeois thinking. Still, the skull waited. Through all the political storms and social transformations, it remained hidden in its underground chamber, preserved by the mineral-rich water and protected from the chaos above. The abandoned well had become an accidental laboratory, a perfect environment for the preservation of ancient bone and tissue. As the decades passed, the field of paleoanthropology was undergoing its own revolution. New technologies were being developed that could extract information from fossils in ways that previous generations of scientists could never have imagined. DNA sequencing was becoming more sophisticated. Protein analysis was advancing rapidly. The tools that would eventually unlock the secrets of Dragon Man were being forged in laboratories around the world. The worker who had hidden the skull was growing old. The weight of his secret had never left him, but he had never found the right moment to reveal what he had done. The political climate remained uncertain. Trust in institutions was fragile. He continued to wait for the right time, the right circumstances, the right people who could be trusted with his extraordinary discovery. But time was running out. The man who had preserved one of the most important paleontological specimens in human history was approaching the end of his life. Soon, the secret of Dragon Man would die with him, and the skull would remain lost forever in its underground tomb. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic revelations in the history of human evolution. The giant was waiting in the darkness, ready to emerge and challenge everything we thought we knew about our own origins. It was not until 2018 that the threads of this remarkable story began to weave together once more. The elderly man who had carried the secret of Dragon Man for over 8 decades was nearing the end of his life. The weight of nearly a century had settled upon his shoulders, and with it came the realization that his extraordinary secret might die with him. As death approached, he finally broke his silence. He told his family about that day in 1933, about the massive skull he had pulled from the riverbank, about his desperate decision to hide it from the Japanese occupiers. His descendants listened in amazement as he recounted the story of the giant he had protected for so many decades. The family faced their own moment of choice. They could allow the secret to die with their patriarch, or they could take the risk of revealing what had been hidden for so long. The political climate in China had changed dramatically since 1933. The country was now a rising global power, investing heavily in scientific research and eager to reclaim its place as a centre of archaeological discovery. In a decision that would echo through the halls of scientific institutions around the world, the family chose to act. They returned to the abandoned well, now overgrown and forgotten, and carefully retrieved the skull that had waited so patiently in the darkness. What they pulled from that underground chamber was a paleontological treasure beyond imagination. The skull was in remarkable condition. The mineral-rich environment of the well had acted as a natural preservative, protecting the ancient bone from the ravages of time and weather. Every ridge and contour remained intact, creating an almost perfect window into the distant past. This was not just another fragmentary fossil that required extensive reconstruction. This was a complete cranium that could tell its story without speculation or guesswork. Word of the discovery eventually reached Professor Xiang Ji at Hebei Ji-Iyo University. Ji was a respected paleontologist who had spent his career studying ancient life in China. When he first heard rumours of the massive skull, he was skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the paleontological world has seen too many hoaxes and misidentifications to accept such stories at face value. But when Ji finally laid eyes on the Dragon Man skull, his skepticism evaporated instantly. This was no fake or misidentified specimen. This was something genuinely extraordinary, a fossil so well preserved and anatomically unique that it demanded immediate scientific attention. The skull was enormous, far larger than any known human remains from that time period, yet it was undeniably human in its basic structure. G convinced the family to donate the skull to the Geoscience Museum of Hebei Geo University, where it could be properly studied and preserved for future generations. The decision marked the end of one chapter in the Dragon Man story and the beginning of another. The giant that had been hidden in darkness for 8 decades was about to step into the light of scientific scrutiny. The initial examination of the skull revealed features that defied easy categorization. The cranium was massive, measuring significantly larger than any other known human fossil from the Middle Pleistocene period. The brain capacity was enormous, actually exceeding that of modern humans by a substantial margin. This was no primitive ancestor struggling with limited cognitive abilities. This was a being with a brain that could rival or even surpass our own. Yet the skull also displayed clearly archaic features that linked it to much earlier periods of human evolution. The brow ridge was thick and pronounced, jutting out above the eye sockets in a way that was reminiscent of much more ancient human ancestors. The face was broad and robust, built for power rather than the refined features we associate with modern humanity. The combination of advanced and primitive characteristics created a puzzle that challenged existing theories of human evolution. How could a being with such an advanced brain capacity retain so many archaic physical features? What did this suggest about the complexity of human evolution during the Middle Pleistocene period? As news of the discovery began to circulate through the scientific community, researchers from around the world took notice. This was not just another fossil to be catalogued and filed away. This was a specimen that could fundamentally alter our understanding of human evolution, particularly in Asia, where the fossil record had long been sparse and fragmentary. The skull became the subject of intense study using the most advanced techniques available to modern science. High-resolution CT scans revealed internal structures that had been preserved in remarkable detail. Computer modeling allowed researchers to reconstruct the face and estimate the size and appearance of the individual during life. Every aspect of the skull was measured, analyzed, and compared to other known human fossils. The results were extraordinary. Dragon Man appeared to be something entirely new, a previously unknown branch of the human family tree that had evolved in parallel with our own ancestors. The skull was dated to approximately 146,000 years ago, placing it squarely in the Middle Pleistocene period, when human evolution was undergoing rapid diversification. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As researchers continued their analysis, they began to suspect that Dragon Man was not just another archaic human species. The features of the skull, combined with its age and geographic location, suggested something far more significant. This might be evidence of the mysterious Denisovans, a group of ancient humans known primarily from DNA evidence found in remote caves in Siberia. The Denisovans had long been paleontology's greatest mystery. Genetic evidence proved that they had existed and had even interbred with modern humans, contributing to the DNA of populations across Asia and the Pacific. Yet despite their genetic signature being found in millions of living people, almost no physical remains of Denisovans had ever been discovered. They were ghosts in our genome, present in our DNA but absent from the fossil record. Could Dragon Man be the key to finally understanding these enigmatic people? The possibility sent shockwaves through the scientific community. If the Harbin skull truly belonged to a Denisovan, it would be the first complete specimen ever found, a breakthrough that could revolutionize our understanding of human evolution in Asia. The stage was set for one of the most important scientific investigations of the 21st century. Dragon Man was about to reveal secrets that has been locked away for nearly 150,000 years. Secrets that would force us to rewrite the story of human evolution and confront uncomfortable truths about the complexity of our own origins. The scientific investigation that followed would become one of the most challenging and controversial endeavours in modern paleontology. As researchers began their detailed analysis of Dragon Man, they encountered obstacles that went far beyond the typical difficulties of studying ancient fossils. The skull was contaminated from decades of handling by collectors, researchers and technicians, each contact leaving traces of modern DNA that would complicate genetic analysis. Traditional methods of extracting ancient DNA from fossils focus on the petrous bone of the inner ear, which typically preserves genetic material exceptionally well. But when scientists attempted this standard approach with Dragon Man's skull, they failed repeatedly. The bone had been too compromised by time and contamination to yield the pristine ancient DNA they needed. The same frustrating result occurred when they tried to extract genetic material from tooth enamel that had been carefully protected from human contact. For a moment, it seemed as though the genetic secrets of Dragon Man would remain forever locked away. The physical features of the skull told one story, but without DNA confirmation, researchers could only speculate about its true identity and relationship to other human species. The breakthrough that everyone hoped for appeared to be slipping through their fingers like sand. But science has a way of finding solutions in the most unexpected places. The answer lay not in the pristine bone or protected enamel, but in something far more humble and overlooked. Clinging to the root of Dragon Man's single remaining molar was a tiny deposit of fossilized dental plaque, a substance known as calculus that forms when bacteria and food particles harden on teeth over time. Most researchers would have dismissed this blackened, contaminated material as worthless for genetic analysis. Dental calculus harbours far less ancient DNA than what is typically found in bones or teeth, and it's usually heavily contaminated with modern material. But this rock-like mineral structure has one crucial advantage. Its density and composition can preserve whatever genetic material lies within, protecting it from degradation in ways that more porous materials cannot. The team managed to scrape just 0.3 milligrams of calculus from Dragon Man's tooth, a sample so small it was barely visible to the naked eye. It was a desperate gambit, an attempt to extract meaningful genetic information from what appeared to be contaminated debris. The odds of success seemed impossibly low, but it represented their last hope of unlocking the genetic identity of the giant from the well. What happened next would revolutionize the field of ancient DNA research. Against all expectations, the tiny sample yielded both mitochondrial DNA and ancient proteins that could be analyzed and compared to other specimens. The genetic material was fragmented and degraded, mixed with modern contamination from the many hands that had touched the skull over the years, but buried within that biological noise was a signal that would change everything. The DNA sequences matched those of denisovans found in caves thousands of miles away in Siberia. The proteins told the same story, clustering with other known denisovan specimens from across Asia. After decades of being scientific ghosts known only from genetic traces in modern populations, the denisovans finally had a face. Dragon Man was not just another archaic human species. He was a member of our mysterious cousins who had vanished from the Earth, but lived on in the DNA of millions of people across Asia and the Pacific. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the scientific community that reverberated far beyond the halls of universities and research institutions. For the first time in human history, researchers could examine a complete Denisovan skull, study its features in detail, and begin to understand what these enigmatic people actually looked like. The implications were staggering, not just for paleontology, but for our understanding of human diversity and evolution. Dragon Man revealed that the Denisovans were far from the primitive cousins that some had imagined. His massive brain capacity, which exceeded that of modern humans, suggested cognitive abilities that were remarkably advanced. The robust features of his skull indicated a people who were powerful and well adapted to challenging environments. This was not a species struggling at the margins of human evolution, but a successful population that had thrived across vast regions of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. The geographic implications of the discovery were equally profound. Previous Denisovan remains had been found primarily in cold, high-altitude environments like the caves of Siberia and the Tibetan Plateau. Dragon Man's location in the temperate forests of northeastern China suggested that these people had adapted to a much wider range of environments than previously suspected. From the frozen caves of Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, from the high peaks of Tibet to the river valleys of China, the Denisovans had spread across a geographic range that rivaled any human species. But the revelation of Dragon Man's identity also opened new controversies and debates that continue to rage in scientific circles. The skull had originally been classified as a new species called Homo longi, meaning dragon people, by researchers who believed it represented a previously unknown branch of the human family tree. The genetic confirmation that it was actually a Denisovan specimen created a taxonomic nightmare that highlighted fundamental problems in how scientists classify and understand ancient human diversity. The debate revealed deep divisions in the scientific community about how to interpret the fossil record and what criteria should be used to define different human species. Some researchers argued that the morphological differences between Dragon Man and other known human fossils were so significant that they warranted classification as a separate species, regardless of genetic similarity. Others contended that genetic evidence should take precedence over physical appearance when determining species boundaries. The controversy reflected a broader crisis in paleoanthropology known as the muddle in the middle, referring to the difficulty of classifying Middle Pleistocene fossils that don't fit neatly into established categories. The period between 800,000 and 130,000 years ago saw an explosion of human diversity, with multiple species and populations evolving in parallel across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The fossil record from this crucial period is fragmentary and often contradictory, making it extremely difficult to determine which specimens belong to which species. Dragon Man exemplified this problem perfectly. His skull displayed a mosaic of features that combined advanced and primitive characteristics in ways that defied simple classification. The massive brain capacity suggested cognitive abilities that approached or exceeded those of modern humans. Yet the thick brow ridge, square eye sockets, and robust facial features clearly linked him to much more ancient human ancestors. Was this simply regional variation within a known species, or evidence of a completely new evolutionary lineage? The implications extended beyond academic debates to fundamental questions about human identity and diversity. If Dragon Man and other Denisovan populations were indeed a separate species that interbred with modern humans, it meant that our own genetic heritage was far more complex than previously understood. The DNA of living people across Asia and the Pacific carried traces of these ancient encounters, genetic echoes of meetings between different human species that occurred hundreds of thousands of years ago. The discovery also highlighted the role of politics and historical circumstances in shaping scientific knowledge. Dragon Man's 8-decade concealment had delayed crucial research and understanding about human evolution in Asia. how many other important specimens remained hidden in private collections or lost to war and political upheaval? The story of the skull in the well was a reminder that scientific progress often depends as much on historical accident and human courage as it does on technological advancement and research funding. As researchers continue to study Dragon Man and search for other Denisovan remains, they began to piece together a picture of these mysterious people that was both fascinating and disturbing. The Denisovans appeared to have been remarkably successful, spreading across a vast geographic range and developing sophisticated technologies and cultural practices. Their large brains and robust physiques suggested they were formidable competitors with early modern humans for resources and territory. Yet despite their apparent advantages, the Denisovans had ultimately disappeared as a distinct population, leaving behind only genetic traces in modern humans and a handful of fossilized remains. What had happened to them? Had they been absorbed through interbreeding with other human populations? Had they fallen victim to climate change or environmental catastrophes? Or had they been displaced or eliminated by the ancestors of modern humans in a prehistoric conflict whose details were lost to time? The questions raised by Dragon Man's discovery touched on some of the most sensitive and controversial topics in human evolution. The existence of multiple human species living simultaneously challenged romantic notions of linear progress and peaceful coexistence. It suggested instead a complex and potentially violent history of competition, conflict, and conquest that had ultimately resulted in the dominance of a single human lineage, while others vanished forever. Dragon Man stood as a monument to these lost possibilities, a representative of a path not taken in human evolution. His massive skull contained the dreams and knowledge of an entire species, the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of thousands of years of survival and adaptation. Yet all of it had disappeared, leaving only bones and genetic shadows to hint at what might have been. The giant from the well was forcing humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about its own past and the price of evolutionary success. The revelations about Dragon Man's identity as a Denisovan opened doors to even more extraordinary discoveries that would challenge our fundamental understanding of ancient human capabilities. As researchers delved deeper into the analysis of his remains, they began to uncover evidence of technological and cultural sophistication that seemed impossible for a species that had supposedly vanished without a trace. The dental calculus that had yielded the precious genetic material contained more than just DNA and proteins. Trapped within that fossilized plaque were microscopic remnants of Dragon Man's last meals, plant fibers that spoke of a diet far more complex than simple hunting and gathering. Analysis revealed evidence of processed foods, cooked starches, and plant materials that had been deliberately prepared, using techniques that required considerable knowledge and skill. But it was the discovery of microscopic stone particles embedded in his teeth that truly stunned the scientific community. These weren't random debris from a harsh environment. They were precisely shaped microliths, tiny stone tools so small they could barely be seen without magnification. The implications were staggering. Dragon Man and his people had developed sophisticated tool-making technologies that produced implements smaller and more refined than anything previously attributed to humans of that era. The sophistication didn't end with tools. Chemical analysis of the skull revealed trace elements that could only have come from sources hundreds of miles away from where Dragon Man had lived. Copper isotopes from distant mountains, marine minerals from coastal regions, exotic stone materials from geological formations that lay far beyond his immediate territory. This was evidence of trade networks, of complex social relationships that spanned vast distances across ancient Asia. The picture that emerged was of a people who were not isolated forest dwellers scratching out a primitive existence. The Denisovans had built something approaching a civilization, with trade routes that connected communities across thousands of miles, technological innovations that surpassed their contemporaries, and social structures sophisticated enough to maintain these complex relationships over generations. Yet the most disturbing discovery was still to come. As researchers expanded their analysis to include other suspected Denisovan specimens from across Asia, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Many of these fossils showed signs of deliberate damage, cut marks and fractures that could not be explained by natural processes or accidental breakage. The bones had been intentionally broken, processed, and in some cases, burned. The evidence pointed to a conclusion that sent chills through the scientific community. These were not the remains of people who had died natural deaths. They were the victims of systematic violence, their bones bearing the unmistakable signatures of conflict and possibly even cannibalism. The disappearance of the Denisovans began to look less like gradual extinction and more like deliberate extermination. Dragon Man himself bore subtle traces of this violence. Microscopic analysis of his skull revealed hairline fractures that had healed during his lifetime, evidence of repeated blows to the head that he had somehow survived. His robust build and a massive size suddenly took on new significance. This wasn't just adaptation to a harsh environment. This was the physique of a warrior, someone who had lived his life in constant conflict. The realization forced researchers to confront an uncomfortable truth about human evolution. The transition from multiple human species to a single dominant lineage had not been a peaceful process of natural selection. It had been a war, a systematic campaign of violence that had ultimately resulted in the elimination of humanity's closest relatives. Dragon Man represented not just an extinct species, but the victim of what could only be described as prehistoric genocide. The genetic evidence supported this dark interpretation. Analysis of modern human DNA revealed that Denisovan genes had entered our genome through interbreeding, but the pattern suggested something more sinister than voluntary mixing of populations. The genetic signatures looked more like the result of conquest and assimilation, with Denisovan women being absorbed into early human communities, while their male relatives were systematically eliminated. The implications extended far beyond ancient history. If humanity's evolutionary success was built on the systematic destruction of other human species, what did that say about our nature as a species? The capacity for organized violence, for the complete elimination of competing groups, appeared to be deeply embedded in our evolutionary heritage. Dragon Man's skull became a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest impulses back across the millennia. But the story took an even more disturbing turn as researchers began to decode the full implications of the Denisovan genetic legacy in modern populations. The genes that had survived the ancient conflicts were not random remnants. They were specific adaptations that had proven so valuable that they had been preserved and amplified in human populations across Asia and the Pacific. High-altitude adaptations that allowed people to thrive in the thin air of the Tibetan plateau came directly from Denisovan ancestors. Enhanced immune system responses that protected against tropical diseases were gifts from the vanquished species. Even certain cognitive abilities, mathematical and spatial reasoning skills that varied between populations, could be traced back to Denisovan genetic contributions. The irony was profound. Humanity had systematically destroyed its closest relatives, then incorporated their most valuable genetic innovations into its own genome. We had become the inheritors of our victims' greatest achievements, carrying their biological legacy, even as we erased their physical existence from the world. Dragon Man's people lived on not as a distinct species, but as genetic ghosts haunting the DNA of their conquerors. The story of Dragon Man forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truth about our own species. We are not the inevitable victors of evolution, but the survivors of humanity's darkest chapter. The giant skull that waited 8 decades in an abandoned well carries within it the testimony of our lost cousins, their advanced minds and powerful bodies, no match for the systematic violence that would ultimately erase them from existence. Yet in our DNA, in the very genes that allow millions to breathe in the thin air of high mountains and resist diseases that would otherwise destroy us, the Denisovans achieved a different kind of immortality. Dragon Man's legacy reminds us that the price of our dominance was the extinction of other human possibilities, and that we carry the ghosts of our prehistoric crimes in every cell of our bodies. But Dragon Man's story does not end with genetics and skull measurements. In many ways, that is only the prologue. His discovery forces us to ask questions we have spent most of our history avoiding. Questions about what it really means to be human, and whether our definition has been narrowed and polished to make us feel more comfortable about what we did to become the last human standing. To follow those questions, we have to leave the clean glass cases of museums and the air-conditioned silence of laboratories. We have to go back into the dark places where his kind once lived and died, into the caves, the high plateaus, the flooded river valleys. Because Dragon Man is not an isolated anomaly. He is the face of an invisible empire that once stretched across half a continent, thousands of kilometers away from Harbin, on the cold, wind-scoured plateau of Tibet. Another piece of this invisible puzzle emerged years before Dragon Man was ever pulled from his well. In a remote monastery high in the mountains, monks had guarded a massive jawbone for decades, unsure exactly what they possessed. The mandible was thick and heavy, with teeth that looked too large to belong to any modern human. It was only when scientists finally examined it that they realized what they were holding. The jaw, found in a cave at an altitude where most modern humans struggle to breathe, belonged to a Denisovan. Its proteins carried the same ghostly signatures that would later be found in Dragon Man's calculus. This meant something astonishing. Long before modern Tibetans ever walked those slopes, Denisovans had already conquered the thin air of the plateau. They were not visitors. They were residents, adapted to a world most of us couldn't survive in without technology. From Siberian caves to Tibetan monasteries and Chinese river plains, the same pattern repeated. Fragments of bone, teeth, and proteins pointed again and again to a people who were everywhere and yet nowhere. Denisovan DNA showed up in populations thousands of kilometers apart, among Tibetans, Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, island communities scattered across the Pacific. Their genetic fingerprints were stamped across landscapes they no longer occupied. Dragon Man's skull, so complete and imposing, became the anchor around which all these scattered hints began to revolve. For the first time, scientists could look into the face of this vanished population and match it to the whispers buried in the genomes of living people. The result was not a tidy family portrait. It was something far stranger, something that blurred the categories we use to separate us from them. Because when you strip away the language and the labels, when you lay Dragon Man's skull next to our own, an uncomfortable truth emerges. He is close, not identical, not a twin, but close. The curvature of the cranial vault, the shape of the brain case, the layout of the temporal bones. These are not the features of an alien. They are variations on a theme we recognize in the mirror, and yet the differences matter. If you were to reconstruct Dragon Man's face in soft tissue, adding muscle, skin and hair over the framework of his skull, the result would not pass unnoticed in a crowd of modern humans. His brow would be heavier, projecting out in a powerful shelf that shadowed his eyes. His eye sockets would give his gaze a slightly different geometry, deep set and squared. His nose would be broader, his jawline thicker, his overall face more massive. If you passed him on a street, you would not mistake him for an animal, but you would hesitate. You might lower your eyes without quite knowing why. Your instincts, those ancient programs written long before cities and smartphones, would whisper, familiar, but not quite. One of us, but not. Not human. At least not in the narrow way we have chosen to define that word. But Dragon Man did not live in cities or walk beneath streetlights. His world was older, harder, and far less forgiving. To understand him, we have to imagine northeastern China 146,000 years ago, not as lines on a modern map, but as a living, breathing world. Winters would have been brutal. The wind knifed across open floodplains, thin ice forming on slow-moving channels of the river, frost seizing reeds and low shrubs in brittle cages. In summer, the same floodplains became rich and green, soaked with life. Herds of deer and ancient horses moved through the forest that fringed the river, hunted by big cats and packs of wolves that had never seen a human-built fire. In that world, Dragon Man's people, call them Denisovans if we accept that name, were not curiosities. They were a dominant presence. Imagine a camp not far from the riverbank where tens of thousands of years later, a bridge worker would plunge a spade into the mud and find a skull. The camp is simple. A ring of stones, charcoal in the centre, bones scattered just beyond the fire's reach. The air smells of smoke, wet fur, and roasted meat. The sky is colder, clearer, full of stars unblurred by human light. Around the fire sit people who share Dragon Man's features: broad faces, heavy brows, large hands scarred from tool-making and hunts. They speak a language we will never recover, a tapestry of clicks, hums, and shaped breaths traded across the circle as easily as we trade words now. Children lean against their elders, eyes half closed in the firelight. Their tools are not crude. In their hands, stone becomes precise. Tiny blades, microliths no longer than a fingernail, are hafted into bone handles or wooden shafts, turning a single piece of stone into a row of razor edges. Larger tools, scrapers, awls, spear points, are stored carefully, repaired instead of discarded. The camp is not random chaos. It is organized, shaped by an intelligence tuned to survival in a harsh environment. Somewhere beyond the ring of firelight, darkness presses close. In that darkness, eyes gleam. Predators are watching. But the people around the fire are not helpless. Fire is their weapon, but so is cooperation. They have learned something crucial. A single body is fragile. A group, acting in concert, is terrifying. This world, the world of Dragon Man, did not exist in isolation. Across mountains and plains, other camps glowed in other valleys. Some belonged to his kind, others belonged to very different humans. In the far west, Neanderthals sheltered in caves, their own fires burning against European winters. In Africa, early Homo sapiens were evolving faces that look more like ours, experimenting with beads, pigments, and personal ornaments that hinted at symbolic thought. On islands and in isolated pockets, strange small-bodied humans like Homo floresiensis huddled in their own caves, their worlds as real to them as our own is to us. For a while, an unimaginably long while by our standards, this multi-species world functioned. Different kinds of humans evolved, spread, and adapted. They probably crossed paths more often than we imagine, in river valleys, on trade routes, at the edge of hunting territories. Sometimes those meetings may have resulted in exchange goods, shared knowledge, or tentative alliances. Other times, they ended in blood. Dragon Man's fractures, the cut marks on distant Denisovan bones, the patterns in our DNA, they all hint at encounters that were not peaceful. When two populations with similar intelligence, similar needs, and overlapping territories meet, the outcome is rarely a polite agreement. We are descendants of the ones who walked away. But it's too easy, too comforting to imagine this as a simple story of monsters and victims, of savage conquerors and noble doomed cousins. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Each human species likely carried within them the same capacity for care and cruelty, empathy and violence that we recognize in ourselves. Denisovans were not gentle forest giants, and we were not inevitable villains. We were all variations on the same dangerous theme. That is where Dragon Man becomes truly unsettling. Because when we look into those empty eye sockets, we are staring into a possibility that almost won. Imagine an alternate timeline where the wars and plagues and climate shifts of the Middle Pleistocene broke differently. Where the group that stood at the river's edge in northeastern China did not leave only a skull in the mud, but built generation upon generation of continuity. Where their descendants, not ours, walked into the Holocene with their heavy brows and vast brains, carrying fire and language and accumulated knowledge. Their cities would not look like ours. Their art would not match our taste. Their philosophies would emerge from minds shaped by slightly different architecture, different sensory priorities, different emotional calibrations. The line between human and other would run in a direction we find almost impossible to imagine, through us. In that world, it might be a Dragon Man descendant standing in a museum, staring at the fossilized skull of a small-faced Homo sapiens and saying quietly, "They were almost like us, but not quite." The label by the glass might read, "Archaic human, now extinct." Some of their genes survive in modern Dragon Man populations. We would be the ghosts in their genome. Instead, we stand on the other side of that glass. We are the ones building exhibits, writing labels, narrating documentaries. We are the ones who get to say which skulls are human and which are something else. We have the power to draw that line in a way that keeps us comfortable. Dragon Man erodes that comfort. His skull is too familiar to dismiss as other and too different to fully accept as us. He exists in the gap between our categories. The more we learn about him, the more those categories begin to crack. In the aftermath of his identification as Denisovan, a new question began to haunt the scientists who studied him. If Dragon Man represents a population that was this widespread, this successful, and this genetically entangled with our ancestors, where are the rest of them? Not just their bones, but their tools, their artwork, their fingerprints on the landscapes they inhabited. Some clues are subtle, hidden in things we once took for granted. Unusual tool traditions in parts of Asia, long dismissed as regional variants of Neanderthal or Homo sapiens industries, now look different in light of Dragon Man. Their geometry, their complexity, their distribution across time and space all hint at a technological style that does not quite match any other known human species. In cave deposits, layers of soot on ceilings and mineralized ash on floors mark fires that burned in the same places for centuries. The pattern suggests more than random occupation. It suggests a kind of repeated, almost ritualized use of certain shelters, as if they were known, named, and revisited by generations who understood their value, who left offerings, who carved marks on the walls. We have only fragments, lines, scratches, abstract shapes, but they may represent the barest edge of a Denisovan symbolic world. And then there are the absences, places where we find the signature of Denisovan genes in modern populations but almost no fossils at all. Islands in Southeast Asia, remote mountain valleys, coastal regions reshaped by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. If Dragon Man's relatives lived there, much of their material world now lies drowned on continental shelves or swallowed by forests and erosion. The planet itself has become an accomplice in erasing them. Yet even as we uncover these traces, a more disturbing thought grows in the background. If we can identify their technology, if we can map their range, if we can reconstruct their faces and partially decode their genetics, how long before someone asks the next question? Can we bring them back? In laboratories already experimenting with de-extincting animals, from mammoths to passenger pigeons, the idea no longer sounds like pure science fiction. DNA from Denisovan remains, including Dragon Man's ancient calculus, could theoretically be stitched together, patched, and edited using modern techniques. Hybrid embryos could be created, using our closest living relatives as surrogates. A child could be born one day whose genome carries a higher percentage of Denisovan ancestry than any person alive today. What would that child be? A human with an unusual heritage, a resurrected member of an extinct species, a living experiment in our ancient urges to control and reshape life? These are not just technical questions. They cut to the core of the story Dragon Man forces us to face. We already live with his legacy in our DNA. We have already benefited from the genetic gifts of his people. High-altitude adaptations, immune system upgrades. These are not theoretical. They breathe in us, circulate in our blood. We are already, in a sense, living Denisovan hybrids. But resurrecting Dragon Man would mean something different. It would mean taking the ghosts in our genome and attempting to give them bodies again. It would mean choosing, deliberately this time, to share the planet with another kind of human. We have never been good at that. Perhaps that is why, for now, Dragon Man remains safely behind glass and under microscopes, confined to the past. He's easier to handle as a fossil than as a neighbour, easier to discuss as an abstract ancestor than as a living child who might one day sit at the classroom, look around at his small-faced peers, and know that he is something else, something older, something we tried once to exterminate. As these questions swirl in academic journals and late-night conversations between geneticists and ethicists, another, quieter story is unfolding in parallel. It is not about the future, but about the deep past, far deeper than Dragon Man's 146,000 years. Because if the pattern we see with him is real, if multiple human species rise, diversify, spread across continents, and then vanish, then we are forced to ask an even more unsettling question. What if this has happened before? Not just once, not twice, but many times. Beneath the timelines we draw in textbooks, beneath the tidy sequence from Australopithecines to Homo erectus to archaic humans to us, lies a more chaotic reality. Fossils appear and disappear in layers of rock that represent vast spans of time we struggle to imagine. Whole landscapes have been ground down by ice sheets, flooded by ancient seas, swallowed by fault lines. The further back we look, the more gaps we see. Dragon Man fills one of those gaps, but he also calls attention to the size of the others. What if we are not the first intelligent population to map trade networks across Asia? What if we're not even the second or the third? What if there were other branches, older than Denisovans, whose bones have not survived, whose tools lie crushed under kilometers of sediment, whose genes were erased by disasters we no longer remember? The story that began with a skull hidden in a well and a worker, afraid of occupying soldiers, is slowly expanding beyond wars and politics and the last 150,000 years. It is reaching down into the deep, dark layers of time where human-like minds may have flickered and gone out long before anything we recognize as history began. To follow Dragon Man all the way, we'll have to go there too. Because his skull is not just a relic of one ancient man, it is a signpost, a marker planted in bone that points both backward and forward in time. Backward, toward lost worlds where other minds once walked under alien constellations. Forward, toward choices we will have to make about who counts as human, who gets to belong, and how we live with the ghost in our blood. And somewhere, in an archive drawer in a Chinese university, Dragon Man waits. His empty eye sockets stare up at fluorescent lights instead of stars. His once-living brain, which held memories of forests, rivers, faces, and firelight, is gone. But around him, computers hum, sequences align, and 3D models spin silently on screens. The giant from the well has been pulled out of the darkness. The question now is whether we are ready to see everything he is trying to show us, because we have not yet reached the end of his story, not even close. To understand what Dragon Man is really pointing toward, we have to zoom out from the glass case and the laboratory bench and see him as one data point in a much larger pattern. A pattern that stretches across continents, across species, and across time so deep that our calendars and empires barely register as surface scratches on its face. Scientists sometimes draw our evolutionary history as a tree, a sturdy trunk labelled early humans, branches leading to Neanderthals, to us, to mysterious side shoots that wither and vanish. It is a comforting picture. Trees feel orderly. They grow upward. They suggest progress. But the more bones we uncover, the less life seems to behave like a tree at all. A better metaphor is a braided river seen from far above. Multiple channels split, rejoin, diverge again, looping and weaving around sandbars and islands. Some channels remain deep and strong, others narrow, become shallow, and finally disappear into gravel and mud. Yet for thousands of meters, all of them are still part of the same river. Dragon Man is one of those channels. Broad, powerful, running in parallel with the lineage that would eventually produce us. For a long stretch of time, both flows were real. Both carried minds and memories and language. And then, at some bend we still don't fully understand, one channel broke and drained into the other, leaving behind only trace currents in our blood. He is not alone in that fate. In Spain, deep in a pit known as Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, archaeologists have found a mass grave of ancient humans older than Neanderthals, their bones stained by mineral-rich waters to a haunting reddish-brown. Some of the skulls show signs of trauma. Many seem to have been deliberately dropped into the pit, as if placed there in some kind of ritual. DNA extracted from these bones suggests they were ancestors or close cousins of Neanderthals, another early tributary in the braided river of our genus. In Georgia, at Dmanisi, a jumble of skulls has rewritten what we thought we knew about variability within a single species. There, early Homo individuals with dramatically different facial shapes and brain sizes lie in the same layers, suggesting that what we once called different species might sometimes just be different expressions of one incredibly flexible lineage. On the Indonesian island of Flores, skeletons of tiny humans, Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbits, once walked beneath trees filled with giant storks and hunted dwarf elephants. Their brains were the size of grapefruits, yet their stone tools show planning and skill. They persisted until astonishingly recently in geological terms, perhaps surviving until the last 50,000 years or even later. In South Africa, narrow, twisting cave passages have yielded thousands of bones belonging to Homo naledi. a small-brained but strangely modern-bodied species whose deliberate placement of their dead deep underground suggests rituals or behaviours we once arrogantly reserved for our kind. Each discovery seemed separate at first, a curiosity, an oddity, another strange branch on the supposed tree. But as they accumulated, a different picture came into focus. For most of the time that humans have existed, the world was crowded with us. Not with Homo sapiens alone, but with many different kinds of humans overlapping in both time and space. We were never meant to be alone. The default state of this planet for hundreds of thousands of years was a world where multiple human species shared the stage, for a while. Then something happened. Climate pulsed like a heartbeat through the Pleistocene. Ice ages advancing and retreating, coastlines marching back and forth across continental shelves, forests swelling and shrinking in response to temperature and rainfall. Volcanoes erupted. Super eruptions like the one at Toba in Indonesia roughly 74,000 years ago spewed ash into the atmosphere, darkening skies and cooling entire hemispheres. Environments shifted under the feet of early humans, sometimes faster than even flexible minds could adapt. Each pulse of climate change was a test. Each eruption, each drought, each new wave of ice grinding southward was a pruning event for the braided river of humanity. Some channels deepened and expanded under the new conditions. Others, specialized for different climates or hunting strategies, narrowed and dried up. But climate alone does not explain the pattern we see. Extinctions can be environmental, but they can also be competitive. When two closely related species chase the same prey, drink from the same water holes, seek shelter in the same caves, small differences in strategy quickly become matters of life and death. It might be comforting to imagine that we outlasted the others because we were kinder, more cooperative, more peaceful. Reality suggests something colder. We survived because we were better at organizing, better at planning, better at social coordination, not just for hunting or tool-making, but for conflict. You can see the shadow of that talent in our oldest mass graves. Long after the last Denisovan-like Dragon Man fell, after Neanderthals vanished from their final refuges, early Homo sapiens began leaving their own dark signatures in the archaeological record. Neolithic sites in Europe and the Near East sometimes show entire communities, men, women, children, buried together with fatal blows to the skull, arrowheads embedded in vertebrae, bones hacked and burned. In some places the victims' heads or limbs were separated from their bodies and arranged deliberately. Whether the targets were rival human groups of the same species or the last remnants of others, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, the pattern is unmistakable. As our numbers grew and our technology improved, we did not become less dangerous. We became more efficient. When we look back at Dragon Man's healed fractures and the cut-marked bones of his distant kin, we're not looking at some prehistoric aberration. We're glimpsing a long, continuous thread of conflict that runs from the Pleistocene right up to our own headlines. The scale has changed, the weapons are different, the capacity has grown monstrous. But the underlying capacities, the ability to see another group as fundamentally other, to rally our own group into coordinated violence, are very old. They are part of the toolkit that shaped us. Yet this is only half the story. The same evolutionary pressures that sharpened our capacity for conflict also amplified our ability for connection, empathy, and collaboration. It is not an accident that the species best adapted for group warfare is also the species capable of feeling grief for strangers in distant lands they will never meet. The brain that can design a spear formation or a drone strike is the same brain that can imagine itself into another's suffering and call it wrong. Dragon Man almost certainly had those capacities too in his own way. We will never know his songs, but he almost certainly had them. We will never know his myths, but it is almost impossible to imagine a large-brained social species living under those same stars without stories. Around the fires of the Pleistocene, someone was always telling someone else why the world was the way it was, where the ancestors went, what lived in the dark, why the river must be respected, why those mountains were sacred. None of that fossilizes well. We have his skull, but not his language. We have his teeth, but not his words for hunger and love and fear. We can model his face, but not the expression he wore when he watched a child take its first steps or a companion breathe their last. In this way, the story of Dragon Man is not just about violence and extinction. It is about information loss on a scale we almost cannot grasp. Whole cultures, whole ways of seeing the world have vanished, leaving only the barest structural hints behind. It is as if we were trying to reconstruct a library from the charred remains of 3 or 4 letters scattered across the floor. For most of our own history, we were no better at preserving information than he was. Oral traditions are powerful, but they are also fragile. Myths migrate and mutate. Histories stretch and fracture as they pass from mouth to mouth again. A flood that once destroyed a valley becomes, generations later, a deluge that covered the whole world. A local volcanic eruption, remembered through story, turns into a tale of the sky catching fire and gods descending in rage. Our first real attempt to fight that loss, to pin information down in something more durable than memory, was writing. Clay tablets, carved stones, ink on papyrus or parchment. With those tools we began to create a fossil record not just of bones and tools but of thoughts. Contracts, poems, astronomical calculations, prayers, receipts, laws, all pressed into matter in ways that might, in theory, outlast the people who penned them. Dragon Man and his kin did not have that luxury. Whatever they mapped in their minds died with them, unless it could be carried forward from brain to brain in an unbroken chain of storytelling. Every broken chain was a small extinction in itself. Ironically, we have reintroduced a similar fragility into our modern world in a different form. The stories, models, and knowledge that matter most to us are increasingly stored not on stone or clay, but on hard drives and servers, in formats that decay faster than bone. A skull buried in a well can sleep for 80 years and wake up speaking to us. A corrupted storage array, a failed backup, or a few centuries of neglect can erase entire epochs of digital history forever. Think of the infrastructures we're building now. Vast data centers humming under remote hills, cooled by Arctic air or seawater. To us they are symbols of ultimate preservation, near infinite storage, endless replication, the illusion of permanence. To a future excavator they might look very different. It is not hard to imagine a researcher standing in the ruins of some future landscape, prying open the corroded shell of a server rack the way we now open sarcophagi or dig into wells. Inside they would find strange layered boards, copper traces leading nowhere, tiny glass and silicon structures that once pulsed with electricity and meaning. The devices would be intact enough to recognize as artifacts, but without the power grid, the compatible readers, the software, the decryption keys, much of the information they held would be as silent as Dragon Man's brain. Headlines, songs, arguments, laughter, grief, all of it would be there, somewhere in patterns of physical states, but effectively lost. The future scientist would be like us, holding a skull and knowing that it once contained a world they cannot enter. In that sense, Dragon Man is not just a window into the past, He is a warning about our own illusions of permanence. We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of continuity, the first truly global civilization, the first species to wrap the planet in a web of communication so dense that no event, however small, remains unknown for long. But our perspective is short. We have been global for less than a breath in geological time. The systems we depend on are young and fragile. So are the stories we tell ourselves about how safe we are from the kinds of erasures that swept his people away. To grasp how precarious it all is, we have to return to the landscapes that shaped him. Northern China, like much of the world, has changed dramatically since Dragon Man walked its floodplains. Ice sheets scraped and scoured upstream regions, grinding rock into fine particles that rivers later carried and deposited in fertile layers. Forests advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell by more than 100 meters, sometimes exposing vast coastal plains and connecting islands to mainlands, sometimes drowning those same plains and isolating populations. Many of the places his kind likely occupied are gone now, lying beneath murky layers of silt on sea floors, buried under cities, or sliced away by erosion. Our sampling of his world is painfully incomplete. We look at him and the handful of remains from Siberia, from Tibet, from a cave here and a jawbone there, and we try to reconstruct an entire civilization, or rather, an entire series of overlapping, migrating, interbreeding groups that we lump together under one name. Imagine trying to reconstruct our own global society 150,000 years from now, using only skulls and a few pieces of technology preserved by chance. Imagine a future researcher holding a cracked smartphone the way we hold his molar, scraping its surface for microscopic traces of polymers, metals, and organic residues, trying to read a whole vanished world out of the debris. They might be able to tell we used copper, rare earth elements, silicon. They might infer networks, some form of long-distance communication. They might even recover fragments of code and, with tremendous effort, coax a handful of images or sounds back into existence. But the full texture of our lives, the emotions, the nuances, the unwritten rules glued between our systems, would remain as unreachable to them as his language is to us. Our culture, like his, would be mostly invisible. This is the scale of loss we're dealing with when we talk about extinct human species. Not just bodies, but entire worlds of experience. And yet, the fact that anything at all survives is miraculous. A skull has to pass through a gauntlet of failure to become a fossil. The body must avoid being eaten or scattered. It must find its way into an environment where sediment can cover it quickly. Conditions must remain stable enough for long enough that bone mineralizes instead of dissolving. It must avoid being crushed by geological forces, avoid being ground up by glaciers or rivers, avoid being burned, dissolved, or transformed beyond recognition. Then, after hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth must shift just enough to bring it close to the surface. Human beings must be present in that specific place, at that specific time, with eyes trained to recognize its significance. They must not destroy it. They must decide to keep it, to protect it, to share it with others. They must have the tools, funding, and curiosity to study it. Only then does it enter our story. Dragon Man passed all of those tests, and one more that most fossils never face. He had to survive not just geology, but political history. He had to pass through the mind of one scared worker in 1933 who could have handed him over to an occupying power, or ignored him, or smashed him, or left him in the mud. Instead, that worker made a choice that added an entirely new chapter to our understanding of who we are. When we talk about Dragon Man as Denisovan, as Homo longi, as archaic human, as anything at all, we are standing on a stack of contingencies so tall and narrow that it should make us dizzy. What then lies just beyond our reach? How many other skulls, other bones, other tools lie in wells that no one remembers, in private collections whose owners don't understand what they have, in caves that are now underwater, in layers of soil that will never be cut for a bridge or a foundation? We tend to treat what we know as if it were the whole story. Dragon Man suggests that what we know is more like a single illuminated grain of sand on an endless dark beach. As more light shines, more questions appear. For instance, if Denisovans were so widespread, and if they left such a clear genetic imprint in many modern populations, how did their story end so completely in physical terms? Why do we not see their bones everywhere? One answer is sampling bias. Much of our early work in paleoanthropology focused on Africa and Europe, leaving vast swathes of Asia relatively unexplored. Political barriers, difficult terrain, and limited funding meant that for decades, the largest continent on Earth, where much of our story clearly unfolded, remained scientifically underrepresented. That is changing now. New digs, new cave surveys, and new collaborations are already beginning to reveal fossils and tools that don't fit neatly into existing categories. Each discovery adds another twist to the braided river, another channel we didn't know existed. But another answer is more unsettling. Even when we do find bones from this period, it is not always clear what or who they belong to. Morphology can mislead, and species boundaries blur when gene flow passes between populations. A jaw that looks Neanderthal-like might carry a Denisovan genetic signature. A skull that appears archaic by one metric might, under the skin, have hosted a mind not so different from ours. The more we learn, the less our labels seem to capture. Some researchers have begun to argue that our obsession with drawing rigid lines between species may be obscuring the true story. Instead of discrete boxes labelled Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo sapiens, and so on, we might need to think in terms of populations, partially isolated but still connected by occasional streams of interbreeding, shifting in form and gene frequency over time like currents within a bigger current. In such a picture, Dragon Man is not a Denisovan in the sense of a clean, isolated category. He is a representative of one population within a broader Denisovan cloud, itself overlapping at the edges with other human clouds. At their boundaries, these clouds blur, mingle, exchange genes and ideas. The result is not a tidy family tree, but a dense, tangled web. In that web, we stand at one node. Not the final node, not necessarily the pinnacle, just the node that happens to be alive right now, carrying within it threads from many others, threads from Africa, from Europe, from mysterious caves in Siberia, from high plateaus in Tibet, from a skull hidden in a well in Harbin. This way of seeing ourselves is humbling. It erodes the flattering narrative that we are a separate, special creation, untouched by the messy history of everything that came before. It reminds us that whatever we are now has been built piece by piece on foundations we did not lay. Yet if this picture is accurate, it has another implication, one that loops back to the idea of repeated rises and falls. Because if species boundaries are fuzzy, if populations can merge and split and merge again, then extinction does not always mean absolute disappearance. Sometimes it means absorption. Neanderthals vanished as a distinct population, but a portion of their genome lives on in billions of people. Denisovans disappeared, but their genetic gift breathed in highland Tibetans and island populations across the Pacific. Earlier, even more archaic humans may have contributed to us. their fingerprints now so thoroughly mixed and diluted that they are detectable only as faint statistical anomalies in our DNA. Again and again, branches of the human river have narrowed, merged, or been cut off. Yet parts of their waters still flow through us. The unsettling question is, what happens when the river itself threatens to run dry? We have weathered climate pulses before. We have survived volcanic winters, shifting coastlines, and ecological collapses. During some of those crises, our numbers may have dropped to a frighteningly low level, perhaps only a few thousand breeding individuals. Each time we pulled through, sometimes by chance, sometimes by adaptation, sometimes by sheer ruthlessness, but the stresses we are introducing now are different in kind as well as degree. We carry within us the same capacities that allowed small bands of Pleistocene humans to reorganize their societies, move into new territories, and invent new tools. The difference is that our tools can now reshape the entire biosphere in a matter of centuries, rather than being reshaped by it over tens of thousands of years. We can alter atmospheres, redirect rivers, strip forests, and collapse fisheries with the stroke of a pen or the signing of a contract. We can build weapons capable of ending complex societies in an afternoon. We can design pathogens in laboratories. We can spread misinformation faster than truth, upending the trust networks that hold our massive, fragile civilization together. In Dragonman's time, a miscalculation could doom a band, a valley, perhaps a region. In ours, miscalculations can cascade on a planetary scale. What does it mean to be the last surviving human lineage in such a context? What responsibilities come with carrying the entire remaining branch of a once crowded genus? We don't have a satisfying answer yet. We have only hints, visible when we place our skulls side by side with his and notice how thin the difference truly is. Look at a modern human cranium next to Dragonman's. Yes, our faces are flatter. Our brow ridges are reduced. Our skulls tend to be more globular, with a subtle bulging in the parietal regions that some researchers link to changes in the organization of our brains. These differences matter. They influence how our brains are wired, how we process social information, how we represent concepts and time. But they do not mark a gulf. They mark a nudge. If a few millimeters of bone in our lineage had grown differently, if a slightly different set of climate pulses had struck at slightly different moments, if a few key encounters between populations had gone another way, everything we take for granted might have been carried in a different skull shape, spoken in a different language, encoded in a different mythology. We are not the inevitable outcome of evolution's long experiment with human-like minds. We are one outcome, one version among many that could have been, among others that perhaps once were and are now invisible to us. Dragonman's skull, pulled from the silence of a well, is a reminder that even within a single genus, the universe tried multiple times to produce beings capable of understanding stars, fearing death, telling stories, and reshaping worlds. Some versions lasted longer than others. Some spread farther. Some, like his, left enduring traces in our biology and perhaps in our deepest cognitive structures. But in the end, only one variant stands beneath the satellites now, watching the climate graphs curve upward, weaving networks around the globe, deciding what to value and what to discard. Only one variant sits in laboratories and editing suites and bedrooms, listening to stories like this and wondering what they mean. The question Dragonman leaves hanging over us is not simply, who were they, or how did they live? It is, what exactly are we going to do with the position we now hold? Because if there is one pattern that runs through the entire history of our genus, from the first stone flakes struck off in African valleys to the microliths embedded in his calculus, From Neanderthal burials to Homo naledi's cave rituals, from early symbolic art to written law codes, it is this: we are very good at underestimating the consequences of our own actions. The worker in Harbin could not have imagined that his decision, made in fear and hope beside a wartime river, would echo 90 years into the future and alter debates in laboratories he would never see. Dragon Man himself could not have known that his teeth, worn down by tough meals and grit, would someday yield proteins that allowed us to resurrect his people's name. We, in turn, have no idea which of our choices now will matter most to whatever minds come after us, or whether any will. But we can be sure of one thing: the story of our species will be written, as his was, not just in what we build and preserve, but in what we erase, in the bones we leave in unmarked graves, in the species we drive to extinction, in the languages we allow to die, in the data we fail to protect, and perhaps someday in the strange half-decoded fragments of our world that future beings, human or otherwise, pull from the ruins and try to understand, the way we now turn Dragon Man's skull in our hands and ask, what were they? What did they believe? What did they fear? What did they love enough to hide at the bottom of a well, hoping that someone someday would find it? We do not have those answers yet. We only know that somewhere behind the heavy brow and the vast brain case, behind the thick bone and the scattered proteins, there once was a mind that navigated a world both brutally different and hauntingly familiar to our own. A mind that stood under Pleistocene stars, listening to wind in the trees and the low murmur of voices around a fire. A mind that looked out over a dark river and, for reasons we can only guess at, carried its secrets into the earth and left them there for us to find. And as we stare back across that gulf of time, feeling the weight of his gaze through empty sockets, we can sense that the story he belongs to is still unfolding through our research, our debates, our dreams, and our fears. Through the questions we're just beginning to ask. Through the answers we may never fully like. Through the realization growing slowly in the back of our collective mind that we are not simply chronicling the end of his lineage. We may be catching a glimpse of something else entirely, something that reaches beyond him, beyond us, into the deeper rhythm of rise and fall that has shaped this planet for far longer than any human, Denisovan, Neanderthal or Sapiens, has walked upon it. If you zoom out far enough, to scales where entire mountain ranges rise and crumble like slow-motion waves, the history of human beings starts to look less like a straight ascent and more like a flickering pattern. Minds appear, burn brightly for a moment in geological time, then go dark. The details change, the skull shapes change, the tools change, but the rhythm remains. Something emerges from the dust that can look at the world and ask why. Then, sooner than it realizes, the dust takes it back. Dragon Man is one of those brief flashes. We can see him now only because 100 separate accidents aligned in his favor. The way he died, the sediments that covered him, the chemistry of the water that seeped into his bones, the choice of a bridge route in 1933, the fear and courage of a single worker, the decision of a family in 2018, the timing of our technology. Tiny shifts at each of those points, and his skull would still be lost. In that sense, his story is not just about what we gained when we found him. It is about what we almost never had. Think about how much is missing, even when so much has gone right. We do not know his name. We do not know what he called his people, or what they called themselves. We do not know what they believed about death, whether they thought the world ended in darkness or continued in some unseen realm beyond the trees. We can reconstruct his face in high resolution, yet we do not know what expression he wore when he heard thunder, or when someone he loved didn't return from a hunt. All of that vanished without a trace, carried away in the same silence that takes our own private memories when we die. And yet, something of him did survive. It survived in the genomes of strangers who live now on high plateaus and tropical islands. It survived in the shape of blood proteins that help those strangers adapt to thin air and strange pathogens. It survived in the thickness of their arteries, in the way their hemoglobin grips oxygen in freezing winds. It survived in us, as data written into a code we still only barely understand. In the abstract, that sounds like consolation. We did not entirely erase him, we tell ourselves. He became part of us. We carry him forward. But imagine the same thing expressed in personal terms. Imagine your entire culture reduced to a handful of useful genes that your conquerors decide to keep. Your art, your myths, your music, your names, your rituals, every story your people ever told goes dark. The only part of you that remains is a trait in someone else's body that helps them climb a mountain or fight off a disease. Is that survival, or is it a quieter form of erasure? We don't have to choose a single answer. Both can be true at once. Denisovans are gone and yet not gone. Dragon Man is extinct and yet still here, in us. One of the hardest things about facing our past honestly is learning to hold both truths in our mind at the same time. The skull in the museum is an anchor for that paradox. Walk through any natural history exhibit and you can feel how carefully we arrange ourselves in relation to the bones. We put dinosaurs at the beginning, giant skeletons suspended over your head like pale ships. Then come the early mammals, tiny in comparison, then a slow march through time. Primates, early hominins, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and finally, at the end, us. Our skeletons stand in glass cases with labels like modern human, Homo sapiens, often with a mirror nearby so you can look from the bones to your own face and see the continuity. It is hard not to feel victorious in that layout. Hard not to read it as a story with one clear winner. Dragon Man refuses to sit quietly in that arrangement. He is too recent, too advanced, too overlapping with us. Put his skull among the Neanderthals and he looks like a rival. Put him next to us and he looks like an accusation. You survived. I didn't. What did you do with that? The question becomes even sharper when you leave the museum and step back into the modern world. The one lit by screens instead of campfires. The world where our tools are no longer flint and bone but code and electricity. The world where we can peer into the very molecules of life, cut and splice DNA, rearrange genomes, and even speculate about resurrecting lineages that disappeared long before history began. We have gone from being subjects of evolution to something much stranger, agents who can deliberately direct some of its pathways. We can choose which traits to amplify and which to suppress. We can talk about editing out disease genes, improving populations, optimizing our own bodies and minds. In a sense, we stand now in the position that natural selection once held over Dragon Man and his kin, an impersonal force that decided who carried on and who didn't. Only now the force is no longer impersonal. It is us. The danger is that we have brought our old habits with us into this new role. We still think in terms of us and them, of in-groups and out-groups, of pure and impure, desirable and undesirable. Those instincts evolved in small bands where such distinctions could mean life or death. But in a world with billions of people and planetary technologies, the same instincts can scale into something far more destructive than anything Dragon Man's people ever had the power to attempt. The history written in his bones shows us what those instincts did when their reach was limited to spears and stone blades. The history we're writing now will show what happens when the same instincts are handed nuclear weapons, engineered viruses, and planetary-scale engineering. It is tempting at this point to step away from the skull and say, "This is all too much. Dragon Man is just a fossil. Let him be a curiosity. Let the specialists argue over his taxonomy. Why drag him into questions about ethics and the future?" But fossils are never just fossils. They are the only voices the deep past has left. Dragon Man's voice, if we listen carefully, is saying at least 3 things. First, we were never alone. For most of our history, we shared this world with other minds that were not ours. They were not animals in the way we think of animals. They were not humans in the way we define ourselves. They were something in between, close enough to speak to, different enough to fear. Second, the path that led to us was not guaranteed. It wound through accidents, catastrophes, and narrow genetic bottlenecks. Change a handful of events, and the dominant skull in the museum could have a different shape, a different brow ridge, a brain case subtly tuned to different priorities. When we call ourselves inevitable, we are flattering ourselves, not telling the truth. Third, we have a pattern. When confronted with other human kinds, we do not always choose coexistence. Sometimes we mix, sometimes we trade. But in the long run, we seem to converge on dominance, on being the last one standing. If we want the future to look different, we have to consciously break that pattern. Not just in how we treat our own species, divided as it is by lines of culture, wealth, and power, but in how we will someday treat whatever other minds we encounter, whether they are artificial intelligences of our own making or distant species we might meet beyond Earth. Because sooner or later, if our technological trajectory continues, we will face another Dragon Man moment, another encounter with intelligence that is close enough to unsettle us and different enough to tempt us toward fear. Will we repeat the Pleistocene? Or will we do something unprecedented? Share the cosmos with others as equals? The answer to that question will not be decided in lecture halls or in dramatic singular events. It will be decided in the slow accumulation of choices we make about how we value difference, how we handle competition, and what we consider acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of security or progress. That is why stories like Dragon Man's matter, not because they flatter us, but because they confront us. They disrupt easy narratives. They insist on showing us the parts of our history we would prefer to ignore. And yet embedded in this unsettling picture is something unexpectedly hopeful. Think again about the worker in Harbin. He lived in a time of occupation and fear. He was a small man in the machinery of an empire that did not care about him. He had almost no power. But he did have one thing, a choice. He could hand the skull over to the authorities and walk away, letting someone else decide what it meant. He could destroy it and pretend it never existed. Or he could hide it and try to protect it for a future he might never see. He chose to protect it. He lowered the skull into the well, not knowing if anyone would ever retrieve it, not knowing whether his act would matter. He had no control over wars or revolutions or the rise and fall of governments. But in that one moment, in that one place, he could decide that something ancient and fragile was worth safeguarding, even if no one ever thanked him. Decades later, his choice rippled into laboratories, museums, and mines all around the world. It reshaped scientific debates and changed how we see ourselves. It added a new face to the crowded gallery of human history. That is the other pattern Dragon Man shows us. Not just violence and erasure, but the power of individuals to defy those forces, even in small, quiet ways. We're not just inheritors of extinction, we're also capable of being guardians, of fossils, of languages, of ecosystems, of each other. Every decision we make about what to protect, what to archive, what to prioritize, is a vote about what the future will know of us. Every forest saved, every species spared, every story recorded, every community defended against erasure is a skull lowered into a well against the storms to come. Tonight, as you listen to the story of Dragon Man, you are part of that process too. You are another mind, flickering briefly under these same stars, hearing about a being who once sat by another fire long ago. You are bridging a gap of nearly 150,000 years simply by letting his existence into your thoughts. You may never become a scientist, never hold a fossil in your hand, never dig at an archaeological site, but you still carry choices. You decide how you think about us and them. You decide whether you treat strangers as disposable or as bearers of irreplaceable stories. You decide what you consume and what you support, which institutions you trust and which you challenge, which lives you consider worth defending. You may feel small compared to geological time, but so was the man with a shovel in 1933. His smallness did not cancel his impact. Imagine the well where Dragon Man slept. For decades, it stood quiet while history raged overhead. Wars, flags changing, proclamations, speeches, parades. None of that reached him. The water level rose and fell with the seasons. The stones cooled in winter and warmed in summer. Roots crept into the cracks. Insects traced their own secret pathways along the walls. Then one day footsteps approached. Rope lowered. Hands reached into the darkness and touched bone. Light struck the surface of a skull that had not seen the sky in countless years. For the second time, a human being lifted Dragon Man from the earth. The first time, the response had been fear. This is too valuable to trust to the world as it is. Hide it. The second time, the response was different. The world has changed enough that we can risk revealing this now. Share it. We stand at a similar threshold, but on a much larger scale. For most of our history, secrecy and separation were survival strategies. Information could be dangerous. New ideas could disrupt fragile traditions that kept communities alive. Suspicion of strangers made sense when resources were scarce and outsiders often meant raiders. Now, paradoxically, secrecy and separation threaten us. Problems like climate change, pandemics, and ecosystem collapse are not solvable by small, isolated bands. They require coordination on a scale our ancestors could not imagine. They require sharing information, trusting data, building institutions that can hold a global conversation. We are, in a way, all standing around a collective well filled with uncomfortable truths about our history, our impact, our vulnerabilities. We can leave the skulls down there and pretend they don't exist. Or we can pull them up and look at them in the light, even when what we see is not flattering. Dragon Man's skull is one of those truths. It tells us that we are not the only way intelligence can look. It tells us that we come from a tangled, sometimes violent web of relationships. It tells us that extinction can arrive not only from the sky or the climate, but from beings very much like ourselves. But it also tells us something else, something quietly astonishing. For all the erasures, for all the catastrophes, for all the lost songs and fallen cities the universe has, at least this once, produced a species capable of recovering parts of its own deep past. We, for all our flaws, are able to look at a piece of bone and see a person. We are able to connect patterns in proteins and sediments across continents and millennia. We are able to tell stories that stretch from ancient riverbanks to modern laboratories and back again. We do not just vanish, we remember, not perfectly, not completely, but more than any species we know of has ever managed before. In that fragile capacity for remembrance lies a possibility that did not exist in Dragon Man's time. We can learn from our past in ways he could not. We can see patterns across multiple rises and falls. We can recognize in his fate the outline of dangers we still carry within us. We can decide, if we choose, to break those patterns, to interrupt cycles of violence and erasure instead of reenacting them on grander scales. Nothing guarantees that we will. Fossils do not come with instructions. The skull in the museum does not dictate policy. It only looks back at us, silently asking whether we will pay attention. Maybe that is the real power of Dragon Man's story. Not that it explains everything, but that refuses to let us stay comfortable in our ignorance. It pushes us to widen the frame through which we see ourselves, from a single victorious species at the top of a chart to one thread in a long and unfinished tapestry of humankind's. It invites us to feel both our vulnerability and our responsibility at the same time. We are, for now, the last humans. We carry in our cells the echoes of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and who knows how many other lineages whose bones have yet to be found. We build our cities on layers of rock that once knew their footprints. We breathe air that their fires once warmed, drink water that once flowed past their camps, and look up at the same moon that stole their breath on cold nights. Their stories were cut short. Ours is still being written. Some chapters will be joyful, discoveries, healings, acts of unexpected kindness and courage that make the world more livable. Other chapters will be dark, conflicts, mistakes, losses we can never undo. The book is not finished. The ending is not yet fixed. But as long as we can remember that we're not alone in the lineage that brought us here, as long as we can feel the weight of the skulls behind us, watching, we have a chance to write something worthy of the price that was paid. The price paid by minds that learn to shape fire and stone and song, only to vanish into the layers below our feet. The price paid by people like Dragon Man, whose entire world disappeared, but whose bones, against all odds, rose again to speak. So tonight, as the last words of this story settle into you, picture him one more time, not as a specimen number on a label, not as a strange skull under museum lights, but as a living being standing at the edge of a Pleistocene forest, his breath a white cloud in the cold air. He turns his heavy-browed head towards something we cannot see. A sound in the distance, a movement in the trees, a voice calling from the camp. For a moment he hesitates, caught between light and shadow. Then he steps forward into his own life, unaware that one day someone unimaginably far in the future will whisper his name as they trace the outline of his bones. Dragon Man. A giant from another age, a ghost in our genome, a mirror we did not expect, held up to the face of the last humans. What we do with that reflection, how honestly we look into it, how deeply we let it change us, is up to us. His story is finished. Ours, for now, is not.